There is a popular claim circulating across financial media that two people can hold the same $1,000 today and 5 years later, one becomes financially independent while the other remains stuck. The explanation usually offered is psychological discipline alone. But that framing oversimplifies reality and risks misleading viewers about how wealth is actually constructed. Yes, behavior matters. But behavior alone does not explain financial divergence. Capital efficiency, access to opportunity, income trajectory, macroeconomic timing, and structural positioning inside the economy all play decisive roles long before mindset enters the picture. When financial content tells audiences that wealth is primarily a thinking problem, it quietly shifts responsibility away from systems and toward individuals. That narrative sounds empowering, but it is only partially true. Because if wealth were purely behavioral, high-income households would rarely remain financially fragile. Yet, across developed economies, millions of six-figure earners still struggle to accumulate durable assets. That contradiction alone tells us something deeper is happening beneath the surface. The real issue is not whether someone treats money like a math problem. The real issue is whether they understand capital flow. Money is not simply saved or spent, it is positioned. $1,000 sitting idle in a checking account is not neutral capital, it is inactive capital. And inactive capital does not compound. It transfers value outward through inflation, opportunity cost, and financial friction. In that sense, unused liquidity quietly strengthens the balance sheets of institutions rather than households. This is why asking, "What can $1,000 do?" is the wrong question. The correct question is, what role does this capital play inside a long-term allocation system? Small capital becomes powerful only when it enters a structure designed for repetition and scale. That is the difference between saving money and building wealth. Many personal finance narratives compare money to seeds waiting to grow. But even that metaphor needs refinement. Seeds do not grow simply because they exist. They grow because they are planted inside environments that support compounding. Financial environments work the same way. Impulse consumption, liability accumulation disguised as lifestyle upgrades, and signaling purchases aimed at social positioning are not neutral spending choices. They are capital-destructive environments. Over time, they convert productive potential into depreciating identity statements. And this pattern explains far more long-term financial stagnation than income level ever could. Another widely repeated claim suggests the best investment anyone can make is investing in themselves. That statement sounds correct, and often is, but without strategic direction, it becomes meaningless advice. Education alone does not create returns. Targeted capability development aligned with market demand does. Financial leverage comes from positioning skills where scarcity exists, not simply accumulating information. This distinction matters because early capital decisions shape future optionality. If the first $1,000 is treated purely as a psychological symbol, it becomes motivation. If it is treated as structural capital, it becomes trajectory. And trajectory is what separates households that stabilize financially from households that compound financially. Most people are taught to begin investing immediately. But investing without liquidity protection introduces fragility into the system. When unexpected expenses appear, and they always do, individuals are forced to liquidate positions at the worst possible moment or borrow at unfavorable rates. That is not investing. That is volatility exposure disguised as discipline. Before capital grows, it must survive. And survival always comes before optimization in any serious financial architecture. This is where the conversation shifts from inspiration to structure. Because the first real decision someone makes with $1,000 is not about maximizing return. It is about controlling risk. And once risk is controlled, capital finally becomes capable of compounding. That is the foundation most financial advice skips, but without it, everything that follows rests on unstable ground. One of the most repeated ideas in personal finance education is the concept of hidden spending leaks. The argument sounds familiar. Skip daily coffee, cancel forgotten subscriptions, reduce small lifestyle purchases. Over time, those savings supposedly transform into significant wealth. At first glance, the logic appears mathematically correct. But financially, the conclusion is incomplete because small spending habits rarely determine whether someone builds long-term wealth. Income trajectory, capital allocation discipline, and exposure to productive assets matter far more than eliminating minor expenses. The real danger is not the $6 coffee. The real danger is low capital velocity. Capital velocity measures how efficiently money moves into systems that generate future returns. When money circulates only through consumption channels, it disappears. When it circulates through productive systems, it multiplies. That distinction explains why some households earning modest incomes still accumulate assets, while others earning significantly more remain financially fragile. The difference is not budgeting intensity. The difference is allocation strategy. Traditional advice focuses heavily on controlling expenses because it is easier to explain than improving earning capacity or asset positioning. But controlling expenses without increasing productive capital exposure only stabilizes finances. It does not expand them. And stability alone does not create wealth. It simply prevents decline. Consider the typical calculation often used to demonstrate the cost of small purchases. A daily coffee becomes thousands of dollars over decades when compounded at market returns. Mathematically correct, but financially misleading if presented without context. Because that example assumes the saved money would actually be invested consistently over decades. In reality, most people do not transform reduced consumption directly into productive capital. They simply redirect spending somewhere else. So the real variable is not whether small expenses exist. The real variable is whether surplus capital enters compounding systems. Without that transition, savings remain static rather than productive. This is where the conversation shifts from budgeting psychology to financial architecture. Households that build wealth typically follow a different pattern. They automate capital movement first, then adjust lifestyle around what remains, not the reverse. Automation changes behavior more effectively than discipline ever can, because discipline depends on daily decisions. Systems remove decisions entirely. When capital is transferred automatically into savings buffers, investment accounts, and skill development resources before discretionary spending begins, financial progress becomes structural rather than emotional. And structure always outperforms motivation over time. Another overlooked factor inside the phantom leak narrative is opportunity cost visibility. Most people recognize the price of what they buy. Very few recognize the price of what they delay. Every month that surplus capital remains inactive is not neutral. It is negative compounding. Delay quietly erodes future flexibility in the same way debt quietly erodes purchasing power. Both operate invisibly until the effect becomes irreversible. This is why early allocation decisions matter more than perfect allocation decisions. Precision is less important than timing. Consistency is more important than optimization. Even modest monthly investments directed into diversified productive assets over long horizons reshape financial outcomes more reliably than aggressive attempts to eliminate small lifestyle expenses. The focus should never be on removing comfort from daily life. The focus should be on redirecting surplus capital towards systems that operate without constant supervision. Because wealth rarely grows through isolated decisions. It grows through repeatable mechanisms. There is also a psychological dimension often ignored in simplified budgeting advice. When financial strategy is framed entirely around restriction, individuals eventually abandon the system. But when strategy is framed around expansion, increasing earning capacity, improving allocation efficiency, and strengthening asset exposure, engagement becomes sustainable. People maintain systems that create progress. They resist systems that create pressure. This distinction explains why some financial plans survive decades while others collapse after a few months. The goal is not to eliminate spending. The goal is to redesign the direction capital travels after income arrives. Once that direction changes, the role of small expenses becomes secondary rather than decisive. And when capital begins moving intentionally instead of reactively, a deeper psychological obstacle starts to appear, one that shapes financial behavior more powerfully than budgeting habits ever could. It is not visible in bank statements. It is not visible in income reports, but it silently determines how people measure success long before they build real wealth. And that force is comparison. Many personal finance discussions describe comparison as one of the biggest reasons people fail to build wealth. The argument is straightforward. Someone buys a new car. Suddenly, your perfectly functional car feels outdated. Someone posts vacation photos online. Your lifestyle begins to feel smaller by comparison. Over time, this pressure supposedly drives unnecessary spending and prevents long-term asset accumulation. There is truth inside that observation, but comparison itself is not the real issue. Comparison is a signal. The deeper issue is how individuals interpret that signal inside a financial system designed to reward visibility rather than stability. Modern economies run on consumption momentum. Businesses depend on continuous upgrading behavior. Advertising does not simply sell products, it sells identity transitions. It sells the idea that progress can be purchased rather than constructed. And when financial advice focuses only on resisting comparison, it ignores the structural forces encouraging it. Because status signaling is not a personality flaw, it is an economic mechanism. Across nearly every income bracket, lifestyle expansion tends to follow income growth automatically. Economists describe this pattern as lifestyle inflation. As earnings rise, expectations rise with them. Housing upgrades replace savings increases. Vehicle upgrades replace investment contributions. Convenience spending replaces long-term planning. Income increases, net worth does not. This explains why higher salaries alone rarely produce financial independence. Without allocation discipline, income growth simply increases consumption capacity rather than capital ownership. And ownership is what determines financial leverage. Ownership produces optionality. Ownership produces resilience. Ownership produces time freedom. Consumption produces temporary comfort. Understanding that difference changes how comparison should be interpreted. Instead of asking whether a purchase looks impressive, the more important question becomes whether the purchase increases or reduces future flexibility. Flexibility is the real measure of financial strength. A larger apartment may improve comfort, but if it increases fixed monthly obligations, it reduces optionality. A luxury vehicle may improve status signaling, but if it delays capital accumulation, it increases dependency on future income stability. Dependency is rarely visible in the moment decisions are made. It only becomes visible later, when opportunity appears and cannot be taken. This is why comparison becomes expensive over time. Not because the purchases themselves are always irrational, but because they gradually convert variable lifestyles into fixed obligations. And fixed obligations reduce mobility inside uncertain economic environments. Financial resilience depends on mobility. Mobility depends on flexibility. Flexibility depends on controlled lifestyle expansion. Another important misunderstanding about comparison is the assumption that people spend primarily to impress others. In reality, most signaling behavior operates subconsciously. Humans evaluate success relative to their environment because relative positioning historically determined access to resources, safety, and cooperation. That instinct did not disappear when economies modernized. It adapted. Today, the same instinct expresses itself through housing choices, brand selection, travel patterns, and visible career milestones. These signals communicate belonging, progress, and security inside social structures, even when they do not improve financial strength. And this is why comparison cannot simply be ignored. It must be redirected. Instead of measuring progress against visible consumption markers, financially resilient households measure progress using ownership metrics, asset accumulation, liquidity stability, skill leverage, income diversification. These indicators rarely appear publicly, but they determine long-term positioning far more reliably than visible upgrades ever could. When measurement changes, behavior changes. When behavior changes, allocation changes. And when allocation changes, trajectory changes. This shift also explains why some individuals maintain modest lifestyles even as their capital base expands significantly. It is not hesitation. It is not fear of spending. It is strategic asymmetry between visible consumption and invisible leverage. Invisible leverage compounds. Visible signaling depreciates. Over time, the gap between those two forces becomes enormous. However, even individuals who successfully control lifestyle inflation and avoid comparison-driven spending still face a deeper constraint that determines how quickly their financial position improves. It is not spending behavior, it is identity alignment with economic opportunity. And that constraint leads directly into the most underestimated investment category in personal finance strategy: capability expansion. Many financial frameworks conclude with the same message: invest in yourself, start early, and let compound interest do the rest. The advice sounds timeless, and mathematically, it is correct. But in practice, compounding alone does not create financial independence. Compounding amplifies direction. It does not choose direction. This distinction explains why two individuals can follow similar saving habits and still reach dramatically different outcomes decades later. Compounding multiplies whatever system already exists. If that system contains productive assets, capability leverage, and income expansion, the results accelerate upward. If it contains consumption pressure, fragmented learning, and delayed allocation, compounding accelerates stagnation instead. In other words, compounding is not a strategy. It is an amplifier of strategy. This is why the idea that simply investing a small amount consistently guarantees long-term wealth is incomplete without understanding what drives return acceleration over time. The largest driver is not market timing. It is human capital expansion aligned with economic demand. When individuals invest in capability upgrades that increase earning power, they are not just improving income, they are increasing future allocation capacity. And allocation capacity determines how much capital can enter compounding systems each year. A small increase in annual investment contributions sustained over decades produces a larger impact than optimizing portfolio returns by a few percentage points. That is the difference between portfolio compounding and income compounding. Portfolio compounding grows assets. Income compounding grows inputs. Inputs determine outcomes. This is why the phrase "invest in yourself" must be interpreted carefully. Reading broadly without direction does not produce leverage. Taking random courses without alignment does not produce leverage. Motivation without market positioning does not produce leverage. Capability expansion only produces financial acceleration when it connects directly to opportunity structures inside the economy. The question is never simply what can be learned. The question is, what can be learned that increases economic value within the next 12 months? That timeline matters because financial strategy operates inside real cycles. Technology cycles shift industries. Monetary cycles reshape asset valuations. Labor markets reward different skill clusters at different times. Learning without awareness of these cycles often produces knowledge that is interesting but not financially productive. Strategic learning produces leverage. Unstructured learning produces noise. This is where compounding identity becomes useful, not as a motivational concept, but as an operational framework. Individuals who see themselves as capital allocators rather than consumers begin to organize decisions differently. They evaluate spending through return potential rather than emotional comfort. They evaluate time through opportunity exposure rather than habit. Over years, this shift transforms how capital flows through a household, and capital flow determines trajectory. Another common misunderstanding about compounding is the assumption that it begins only when investment accounts are opened. In reality, compounding begins much earlier. It begins when liquidity buffers reduce financial stress. It begins when skill upgrades increase bargaining power. It begins when spending patterns reduce dependency on unstable income sources. These forces compound simultaneously. Security compounds. Knowledge compounds. Positioning compounds. When those three engines activate together, even modest starting capital begins to behave differently. It stops functioning as survival liquidity and starts functioning as strategic capital. This is why the first $1,000 someone controls is not important because of its size. It is important because of what it activates. Liquidity protection reduces forced decision-making. Capability investment increases earning flexibility. Market exposure begins portfolio growth. Together, these three mechanisms form the earliest version of a compounding system that can operate across decades rather than months. However, the final insight most financial advice leaves unspoken is this: execution matters more than optimization. Many individuals wait for better timing, higher income, or clearer certainty before building allocation systems. But financial systems rarely improve through waiting. They improve through iteration. Early systems are imperfect. That is expected. What matters is whether capital begins moving intentionally rather than passively, because long-term financial independence rarely begins with large investments. It begins with small systems that continue operating even when motivation disappears. And once those systems exist, compounding stops being a theory. It becomes a trajectory.